Today's guest is Kayla Coburn, the founder of Inclusion Starts Now. Kayla was a special education aide turned special ed teacher turned children's book author. She's determined to help schools and children's organizations become more inclusive because every child, no matter if they have a disability or not, wants to feel included. She breaks down the fears and uncertainties that many adults have when confronted with how to build an inclusive organization, school, or home. When it comes to sex education, many times when people hear the word inclusive sex ed, they immediately think it's LGBTQ friendly or it uses gender neutral language. But is it really inclusive sex ed if it isn't addressing young people who are living with disabilities? I asked Kayla what she thinks is missing in sex education for kids living with disabilities and who are neurodivergent. What's her thoughts on age-appropriate versus developmentally appropriate sex ed? We talk about the show Love on the Spectrum, as well as what is the terminology we should be using these days, and she shares with us her latest book that will be coming out. Without further ado, I can't wait for you to meet my friend, Kayla Coburn. Hi, Kayla.
Hi, how are you?
I am great. I am thrilled that you are here. I really appreciate you joining me.
I am so excited to be here and I'm so excited. We connected on social media.
It's amazing. It's also, it's one of those times when social media is actually social. It's awesome.
Yeah, I absolutely
um,
love it.
it's great. It's really great. I mean, there's sometimes where it's like the comment section just goes like
Um,
downhill, but then I meet wonderful people like you, and it's like, yes, this is what this is meant to be.
yes, I very much have a love-hate relationship with social media,
Totally.
but this is definitely the love part. So,
All right. Well, I have so many questions for you. Let's just like kind of jump into it. But before I jump into like the sex ed questions, I want to get the terminology correct. Okay. So when I was working in schools, I always heard in, the classroom for the children living with disabilities, it was always called like the special ed class or special education class. What is the correct terminology when it comes to referring to that classroom or individuals living with a disability?
well, really, it is the special education classroom. That is just really what it is. I know schools have different names for it. They used to call mine SDC, like special day classroom. And then, I mean, it is the easiest way to identify like the general ed students and the special ed students, even though we want special education, the students who are in a special education classroom, we want them seen as general education students first. Um, but unfortunately, that's just not what it is in a lot of schools. But for the language for like people with disabilities, that's usually my fallback is I'll say people with disabilities unless I know that the person that I'm with wants to be called like a disabled person or a lot of times it's in the deaf culture and the autistic culture where they are like a deaf person, an autistic person, like that's a huge part of their identity and they're very and like using the language like that makes them very proud, which of course I totally support. But as a person without a disability, I also who like works with people with disabilities, I also know people who prefer people with disabilities. So it really depends on what they want as like the person who has the disability. So that probably did not help very much. But I mean, as long as you're like, being as
Okay,
respectful as you can be.
we're not saying a special needs student. So it's a
Oh
special
yeah,
education
special
class,
needs.
but not special needs.
Special needs has really been a targeted word right now that people want out. Um, even and so my teaching credential is in extensive support needs, which used to be the moderate severe credential, but even like the mild, moderate, severe, like rating someone's disability was, I mean, offensive to people that it was like, yeah. So that, and also handicap, that's been a word that people are trying to steer away from. And so all those like handicap parking spots, handicap bathroom stalls, they're changing it to accessible parking spots, accessible bathroom stalls. But I think just what's really important is that, use the language that you know or you're like trying to be inclusive. And if someone corrects you, like trying not to get offended and being like, oh, okay, I'll use that.
Very good. Yeah, I think
So,
that's a
yeah.
really good point. It's always like with the intention that you're leading, right? If you're intending to do good, not cause harm, then that is the intent.
Yeah.
And hopefully the people understand that you just didn't know. But hopefully maybe they hear this interview and they are like, okay, I will just use that terminology. I'll get rid of those words and just do my best. So
Yeah. It's hard
yeah,
at first, but we
it
got it.
is. It is. Especially when I think a lot of people like myself, when I was in school, it was separated, right? Like we
Yeah.
really were not included in class or activities with the kids that were in the special ed class. So
Yeah.
really just learning how to interact, learning how to talk, right? Like it just was like, oh, they're special, so we'll just let
Hmm.
them be. But they
Mine
didn't
was
help
the
us.
exact same.
Yeah.
The exact same. There was a table that was far away from all of the like general ed peers. And we would look over at that table and like see, we'd see them separated from everyone. And it was just like, that's what was normal. And gladly, I'm very happy that I feel like that is decreasing. We are moving towards more inclusive settings and communities, but takes time, takes education.
Totally,
That's why we're
totally.
here.
And so why don't you tell us about your organization, Inclusion Starts Now? I mean, I found you on Instagram and I was like, ooh, I love everything about this and your personality and all of your reels. So can you tell us a little bit about what your organization is and what they do and how people could get in contact with you if they wanted to?
Yeah, so this all started because I was a teacher. I was a special education teacher, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna, make an Instagram account about what I'm doing in the classroom because I went to grad school where we were very focused on inclusion. And then I got to my school site and I was like, oh, people don't know about inclusion. Like I was shocked that other special ed teachers I was working with like had no idea with all like about the practices that I was doing. And so then it kind of made, I started doing the account. And then I had a really rough year of teaching. So I kind of gave up on the account. And then we moved and I picked it back up again. And now it has become a way to support teachers who are trying to get inclusion happening at their school. I've worked with schools, like schools can hire me as their inclusion specialist, where I come in and I usually work with like, I coach a small team with their school and then like help them implement the practices. And it's all really unique based off of the school and what their own school culture is, their values, their goals. Because inclusion really does look different on everyone. Like, I'm not saying tomorrow every single person needs to be doing the exact same thing because that's not inclusive. That's
Right.
just like forcing everyone to be together. It's really teaching people how to like advocate for themselves of like what they want and how they want to be included.
Yeah.
So I do a lot of trainings and stuff all about that.
That's wonderful. I think for many organizations, many schools, many parents, they want to like for me in working in sex education and working with a lot of parents, I've noticed that they want to be having these talks. They want to be saying things age appropriately and medically accurate at the right time. And not too much, not too little, just the right amount. It wants to be perfect. And so the fact I think is the same when it comes to talking about disabilities. So I think they just don't know how to say it, what's correct. They don't want to mess up,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
And that it's so much education. And I mean, there's so many great people out there now. I mean, there's so many people on social media that I love and like adults, like self-advocates who are now adults who have written great books that talk about all of this stuff. But
Mhm.
it's that, that step of educating yourself, putting yourself out of your comfort zone, which I'm sure is a lot. Like you see that a lot with sex education. Like you really have to like step out of that comfort zone that you've been living in.
Right, especially if you didn't have the talks yourself, right? Or you never
Mhm.
were, talking about disability before. You may not know how to explain it to your kids, right? So it could be finding those words, and you help parents find those words. So,
Yeah.
I mean, this next question that I have for you is kind of probably, I know what you're going to say, but I think we need to get it going. Like, how important is sex education for children living with disabilities?
So, so important.
Yes.
Um, First off,
Yeah.
people with disabilities have a higher chance of being sexually abused because they are in the hands of a lot of caregivers and
Mhm.
they don't always get taught to self-advocate, to say no. Like if they're not feeling comfortable, they don't always have a way to say, like, I want this done differently. And that just can put them in a really vulnerable spot. And I think parents a lot of the time just like, they have a lot on their plate. When you have a child, you don't know if they're going to have a disability or not most of the time. And that having a child is so hard. And now when you're being thrown into having a child with a disability in a pretty ableist world, it's hard. You're learning to be the advocate. You're learning about all these new therapies. Like your schedule gets crazy. If there are medical needs, you have to figure all that stuff out. And so I think it just is kind of easy to put sex education like on the back burner, but then kids go through puberty and they start, exploring their bodies and people don't want to talk about it with them. And it's like, these kids become adults. And if they've never been taught about consent or about private or public spaces or like their own body changing, that's going to be so much harder to try to learn all that as an adult. Um, so I think it's so important to talk about it
I have
as
a
soon as
question for you, because when it comes to sex education, I say age appropriate when it comes to topics to be have what the sex ed guidelines say. I also think many parents understand age appropriate because we've been following milestones from the moment, baby was born. We were on those milestones. We were on the Wonder Weeks. We were on, I forgot
the
now.
Wonder
Yeah, all of those things. So, but sometimes when I put out content, a lot of parents will say, it needs to be developmentally appropriate. And I go, yes, it has to be developmentally appropriate, but it still has to be based off of their age. And especially if they're going through puberty, they need to know
Yeah,
some things. What are your thoughts on this?
that is such a great question. I went, so my program focused a lot on like what is age appropriate for the student, and not so much developmentally, but it's like if a student is 10 years old and they're still like very much obsessed with Barney, like is there a way to teach them like something that's more age appropriate for them to connect with their peers? And whenever I talk about this, I do usually get people pretty heated and mad because they think I'm telling you like you're not allowed to watch Barney or something. And
Mhm.
it's like, everyone has their own things. Um, but how do we also teach like to the student what their peers are doing? Because again, I mean, people are going to keep growing up, and once someone is like 40, if they're really interested in like a singer who's under 18, everyone's
Mhm.
going to get really mad at that situation. And it's like, okay, but if they were never taught that like, age does mean something, even if like cognitively you're not testing at the level because of whatever assessment you got, like you're still growing. Every year you're becoming that new year by like our community standards. And by 18, you're a legal adult. And so it's like we can't, if their cognitive assessment is saying that they're at 4 years old, like they have still gone through puberty, they have still grown. If they have a uterus, could have gotten their period by now. Like, well, they probably have, but like it's just, I do think it is really important to still have those conversations. And I think the conversations do look a lot different because there's a lot more like direct, like they're not going to maybe learn as much from their peers as like the general ed population of like, because that's kind of how I learned a lot of my sex
Mm,
education was through my peers.
right.
And people with disabilities don't always get that option because if they're like segregated in their special education classroom, they're with 8 students who all might be like touching themselves in class because they've never been told that we don't masturbate inside of a classroom.
Mhm. Or what
Um,
masturbation is.
yeah.
Right.
And then people just tell them no, and they're like, why?
Why?
Like, there's just
Exactly.
no conversation. So, I
Yeah.
think that I would love to look so much more into like research about that because I feel like that's a great question.
Yeah, no. Well, one of the reasons it kind of made, it's something that I deal with a lot because, a lot of parents are very, very concerned about what is age appropriate. And, they'll push back on a lot of things that, I'll say, this is what kids are asking at this. This is why it lines with these guidelines. And, but we don't have a lot of that for our neurodivergent kids. For example, can we talk about the show Love on the Spectrum for a second?
Yes.
Okay.
I have watched two of the new episodes.
Okay.
Uh,
I think you've watched more than me of the new season. I forget which season we're on, but I have watched it, and there's been a lot of like discussion about it. And I think one of the things that I take away from it is that it really shows how autistic children turn into autistic adults. And all of a sudden, they're put in dating situations and they are, learning how to date for the first time. What do you think parents can be doing in helping their neurodivergent kids earlier on so it's not at 25, 28, sometimes in their 30s, learning to do
yeah.
this?
Well, I think it is that and again, it's really going to be like stepping out of your comfort zone because it's a lot of direct learning. So I'm going to take a step back and talk about that really quick. When I used to work in the deaf-blind field, we did a lot of training about like incidental learning, which is how the majority of typically developing children learn their information. So like the example is like if I turn on the TV, I have never showed my children, they're 3.5 and 2. I have never showed them how to turn on the TV, but both of them very early on were able to find the remote and press buttons like facing towards the TV
Right.
because they like saw me doing that. So that's like an example of incidental learning. Secondary learning is like a teacher to a student or a parent to their child. So that'd be me like showing them the remote and telling them this is for the TV, like this is the power button. And then direct hands-on learning is really giving them the remote, showing them the button, help like really walking them through each step. That takes a lot more time and it makes you think a lot more about like all of the steps that go into something that you
Mhm.
probably incidentally learned. And so that is a mind shift I think people need to make when talking about sex education for people with disabilities because you are, you need to you need to teach them like the social cues that you're looking for. Actually, so season two, episode two, or maybe it's like the end of episode one, this guy is doing speed dating.
Ah,
And
yes.
while he's talking to the woman, she says that she doesn't like nature. And in front of her, he puts like no
Yeah.
and writes down doesn't like nature.
Yep.
And and then the director's like, you should probably wait for them to leave so they don't see that. And you could see that he was like, oh my gosh, I had no one had told him that because like that's just a step that you would think people would know because at some point you probably had a relationship where you accidentally said something and that person got mad and you learned from it. But now we know that like that guy has not had a lot of relationships.
Hmm.
And yeah, he's in his 20s still like figuring out all these social cues that we need to be like directly taught to people, especially people on the spectrum, because that is like a social disability for a
Right.
lot of or for
Yeah,
everyone.
no, I think that makes a lot of sense because I work with a lot of parents who reach out to me and they're like, my child's autistic, and I want to make sure that they have this information, and I'm like, it's going to be repetitive. You're going to have to say things in consistently and clearly and said in the exact same way, right? We're not going to be changing what we say and being like, you remember when we talked about da 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 da. Well, this is similar. No, it needs to be like this is this, and then this, right? Like we have
Yeah.
to do that a little bit if we're going to help them so that we're not at Love in the Spectrum season 45 and we're still dealing with the same issues for the next
Yeah.
generation, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And I think other things that they've I mean, being able to directly teach like compromising and that you're not going to find someone who's going to be like this perfect person that likes
yeah.
all of your interests, but like maybe you'll like one of their interests, and maybe like that woman will like nature. Maybe you'll take her for a hike and she'll be like, this is amazing. But like even having that conversation of like this imagination of like what could happen, what might not happen, being let down, and like just all those things really need to be talked about.
Yeah.
Um,
So,
yeah.
what would be your advice to parents? What are some more inclusive practices in maybe the sex talks or sex education that parents could be implementing in the home to help guide their children?
I mean, I would say to especially your content that you post, because you talk about what ages like kids are asking questions and what kind of things you should be talking about. Like, I think finding a good middle ground of like that information and then like accommodating it to your specific child.
Hmm.
So, like masturbation. Like
Hmm.
that's something of explaining like what it is and then also being able to explain like where we do it. Like kind of
Okay.
breaking down each area of like like what is a public place and what is a private place and like literally giving them, two or three safe private places, like if it's in their room or if it's in
Hmm.
like the bathroom, or, like where can you be give that accommodation so it like works
Yeah.
for the child.
Totally.
But
No, I think that is extremely important because when I tell parents like, hey, I run a course that's around sex, masturbation, and porn because those are the three main topics that many parents want to get right. When it comes to the masturbation talk, many parents are like, well, they'll just kind of figure it out, right? Do I have to like explain it? And I'm like, yes, 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 you do.
yeah,
And there's a reason why. And, there's an easy way to do it. It's not that hard of a conversation, but it's really hard for a lot of parents because it's all fully pleasure. Like there's nothing in that talk that's about
yeah,
reproduction or, any sort of thing. It's something people do because it feels good.
yeah,
And so yeah, so it's very difficult for many parents to say, but they want to just gloss over. They're like, they'll figure that out. I'm like,
yeah.
yeah,
I wish that more people talked about sex education with their kids. And I mean, again, my kids are so young and we definitely like, our body parts are called what our body parts are called. Like,
yep,
um, we, we're so big on consent. Like if
good.
anybody says no, even if they're like, if they're turning away, we talk about that. Like it's a lot of keeping how do we take care of our bodies and like brush our hair and take a shower and all that stuff. And I feel like that is all part of sex education. Like that is, I mean, even teaching like how to wipe of like front to back or
Yeah,
like, those are all things. And I feel like those are also really great practices just to like start. Because I don't think people like saying vulva.
yeah.
Like,
Yes, I think a lot of parents are very uncomfortable with saying vulva and vagina. And, even YouTube here sometimes is very uncomfortable with me saying some of these words. And then
yeah.
especially using children as well. They're like, whoa, 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 we need to review what you have put out here. But
And
many
I was gonna
times,
ask if I was allowed to say it.
yeah. Yeah, no, it's all good. Don't worry. Well, so Kayla, you have worked in this field for a long time. You have Inclusion Starts Now, and you've also written some books. Can you tell me a little bit about your books and what they're about and how they could help parents?
Yeah, so this all started because I was a one-on-one para for a student who is deaf-blind, and I just realized like we'd keep getting books and they never had deaf-blind representation. So that was pretty much how this all started. And I think the first book was just like really therapeutic for me to be like, this is like different ways that we communicate, different ways that we can get around the classroom. And it doesn't mean that we don't want to be in the classroom but like, like that, the importance of making friends. So that's this one. I am on a green screen for
Tyler the
anybody who
Snake.
thought that I was extremely wealthy and had this beautiful bookshelf behind me. I'm not. Um, but Tyler the Snake was my first one. And then I was like, I don't know, why not write more? And so then I did Dallas the Dog, and this is all about having an inclusive Halloween. We do also talk about Dia de los Muertos in here. Um, And we have some LGBTQ representation where one of the parents, they're two dads.
Mm.
So that was, I mean, it's like all a lot of like subtle inclusion things.
Yeah.
And then the third one that's being printed somewhere in another country,
Mhm.
is Miguel the Chameleon, and that is all about different holidays celebrated during the winter season. And that one rhymes. I'm really excited about that one. But
Cool.
even after I like approved it to get printed, one of my friends was like, "Does it celebrate this holiday?" And I was like, "No." But it celebrates like 7 holidays in the book. I was like, "Man, I tried so hard to look up all of these holidays. I asked people." I'm like, so I'm sure there's a few missing, but
But the
there's a
intent was to be inclusive, right? Like this is where we come.
yes,
We're coming from this place of we're trying our best. And if we did
yes,
not do it, we're gonna do better next time, right? And that's
that's
the whole
exactly
point.
it.
Very good.
Oh, and
And
then
so go ahead.
I was gonna say I totally forgot to tell you where you can get them.
Yeah.
They're all on my website. I 100% self-published all of these books. So I have about like 1,800 books in my garage right now of all these books. And I like sign them if you want them signed. I usually throw in a sticker sometimes, but they're all on my website, inclusionstartsnow.com under the shop tab. They're like the first thing that come up.
Perfect. I will link it in the description below. You can go and shop to your heart's content. Kayla, thank you so much for being here. This was really wonderful. And I feel like I could talk to you and ask you like a million more questions. And so we might have to do part two eventually, but I really appreciate you being here. And if anybody has questions, throw them in the comments or go follow Kayla on Instagram where I follow her. And you're also here on YouTube and TikTok as well.
Yep, all the same name. Doesn't
All the
change
same
any.
name. All right. And so that's all linked in the description as well. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy that we have been connected. You are such an awesome resource and now best friend because that's how that worked out.
Absolutely. This is how it works. I can't wait. All right. Thank you so much. And I'll be following you as everybody else should here on YouTube and on Instagram for sure.
Thank you,
Okay.
Kathleen.